All right, go for it.
Good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever the heck in the world you are. It's the one, the only notorious Senor Silverback himself, with El Cookie working on the turntables of production over here, making sure that the lithium crystals and the flux capacitors are coming out swimmingly smooth. So this wonderful broadcast with none other than the man, the myth, the legend himself, the voice of sanity in a sea of confusion. London Paul is with us, folks, and it's time for the Sirius report. And guys, here's the deal. I don't know. Look, I understand it's the fall. Everything is pumpkin spice right now. And before you go to Starbucks and plop down $5 on a venti pumpkin spice latte, pause, take a deep breath, take the $5, put it back in your wallet, and go right to the SiriusReport.com and subscribe to London Paul's special member services where you're going to get daily briefs directly from the man himself. It is your own presidential briefing given to you daily by London Paul, letting you know the play by play of what is really going on in the world, strategically valuable information from one of the few sources that gives it to you straight, unadulterated, unfiltered, raw truth. So, again, step away from the pumpkin spice and go to the SiriusReport.com. That's SIRIUS. Sirius Report, the SiriusReport.com. Subscribe to their member services. With that being said, Paul, what's going on, buddy? How are you?
Well, I'm very well. How about yourself? And obviously, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone listening.
Yes. Oh, I'm doing good, man. I'm hanging in there, recovering from a little bit of a cold. It was that time of the season where, this has been a very bad fall. We're in October, Paul, and it's like 90 degrees outside. It's weird. Humid, it's hot. I'm like, my body's like, what's going on?
Right, yeah, I guess we probably should start talking just briefly about Las Vegas. If we don't talk about it, it's kind of like, why didn't we talk about it? Although I'm not going to get into all the whys and wherefores. Or yeah, this guy Paddocks is, of course, alleged is the best way of describing it, to kill 58 people from this 32nd
Of
floor in this
course.
Mandalay Bay hotel, and of course we know full well that he didn't do it, but yes, there's probably multiple shooters. Where did they come from? Nobody knows. And frankly, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's the classic handheld note was found near him where he's mysteriously killed himself.
Wow.
And it included all these calculations how he's going to kill as many people as possible in the crowd. I mean, obviously he's a physicist as well or something like that. But
Oh, he's a ballistics expert, Paul. Did you not
and a
know that?
ballistics expert. And then his body was found surrounded by this arsenal of weapons and stockpile of ammunition. The fact he managed to get it into the hotel is incredible, and all the CCTV and security cameras. But the thing is, it's a classic kind of patsy. It's almost exactly in the kind of Lee Harvey Oswald mold. There is no way this guy's done this. Now, the question is, what's it really all about? And of course, everybody immediately jumps, well, it's about gun control. Well, the fact is that will never work. We've seen countless occasions before in recent years where they've tried to get the debate about gun control happening. But let's be honest. If you were Donald Trump, what's the one thing you wouldn't do? You would not sit there and go, well, okay, let's introduce some legislation on gun control, because in the midterms next year, he's going to get annihilated. I mean, that's an inevitability.
Right.
So the question is, for me, it's not about gun control, even though that seems an obvious thing. The question is straight away is, how are they going to depict this Paddock guy? What ultimately are they going to suggest he is? Now, there's this alleged ISIS claiming they responsibility. Well, frankly, they claim responsibility for everything at the moment because they're in such disarray in the Middle East. So
Yep. They're surrendering in
I
mass.
don't buy I don't buy a word of that. I mean, and yet it's being picked up on, oh, somehow he was some guy who's connected to ISIS. That's dubious is being polite. I mean, frankly, it's nonsense. So, but eventually, how are they going to depict this guy? That for me is what this is all about, because we're back to the old divide and conquer tactics within the US. They
Mm-hmm.
want to. It's a bit like the whole alt left, alt right thing. Notice how quickly that died a death.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
it was a big headline news for about a week and a half, and all of a sudden it's died a death. And it's the same thing Yeah, it's absolutely horrendous that people have died, and we're not trivializing the actual event. But the reality is this will probably all die a death pretty quickly. Gun control won't become an issue. It depends how much they try to milk who this Paddock guy is, and at some point are they going to affiliate him with something? But it's all part of divide and conquer tactics, because the desperation for the cabal is to instigate a civil war in the US. That is what they're trying to do. And they're taking desperate measures to do this. And this is another example of a desperate measure. And undoubtedly, they're behind this in some way, shape, or form. But I'm not going to get into all the whys. I mean, I don't see much point in trying to analyze every last issue as to who was responsible, how many people were involved, and what happened. That, yeah, if you want to do that, fine. But from my perspective, that's not the issue. The issue is, what's this really about? And I don't believe it's gun control, because it'll never happen. If any president who does that is committing suicide in doing so. And yeah, we'll hear Clinton coming out with, well, we need to have gun control. Well, actually, the gun he used was illegal anyway, but that's beside the point. But we always hear all this hot air rhetoric for a week or two, and then it dies a death, because it's just not politically expedient to do this. But I do think the rationale for doing it, as well, is to engender fear in the American people. And ultimately, let's see what they brand Paddock as, because they'll try and twist it and spin a narrative, even though I don't believe for 1 minute he was even involved. But he's the patsy, he's the guy that they're going to try and spin some narrative, and it's all about divide and conquer tactics with the US people. That's, for me, what I think's going on.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And then, it's funny. I mean, when you look at the little background digging on this Paddock individual, apart from the fact that he's a physicist and he's also a ballistics expert, and he's well trained and well versed in various different forms of firearms, and he's also an expert sniper, and he's able to hold an M249 SAW or whatever assault rifle he used and send off round after round, round after round, even though he's an out of shape 64-year-old living in a retirement community. He was also a leftist. He loves to wear his pussy hat, his pink pussy hat. He loves wearing that as well, Paul. And he probably wore that pink pussy hat as he was lobbing lead into the crowd down below.
I mean, the other point is, so far all you're hearing is, well, no one can understand possibly what his motive was for doing it. Well, there's your answer.
Yeah, exactly.
The guy has no motive. And it's just a classic patsy, someone they could frame, and undoubtedly, we'll see what happens. But very sadly, from respect to people dying, but this will probably die a death pretty quickly. And in a month or two, no one will even remember it. No one will be discussing, except the poor families who've lost their loved ones in this attack. So, and that's a sad indictment of the world we live in. But you can call it an act of terrorism, you can call it whatever you like, but it's undoubtedly, this isn't the end of these things. These kind of things are going to keep happening. We've said it's going to happen in Europe. It seems like it might spread to the US. This may be a one-off incident, we don't know, but it's very likely it won't be. And that's the big question and the big problem. And in a way, it's good that people do talk about it, because you get more and more people out there who don't know what's going on, questioning the official narrative. And I do think that's an encouraging sign that a lot of people are going, hang on, I just don't buy the official narrative, even people who previously may have done so. So in that sense, that's a good thing. But from my personal perspective, chewing over the detail of exactly what's happened, it really doesn't change the outcome and doesn't change what the real motive is. And for me, the motivation and what the reality of why this has happened is what matters. And that's the important factor that everyone needs to take out of it, more than understanding to the nth degree exactly what happened and who was responsible.
Yeah.
Because ultimately we know really who is responsible, but putting names to it is not really relevant from my perspective. And I'm not in any way diminishing what's being done, but I think until we get a point where the reality is known by everybody, or a majority of people, say in the US or the UK or anywhere else these events happening, that's when the big change will happen, when people realize the reality of what's happening, as opposed to the narrative that is rammed down their throats by the mainstream media and similar outlets.
Yeah, exactly. I agree with you wholeheartedly, man. Moving forward, many big news, Paul. Many big news internationally. That is, many people are distracted by the shenanigans in Las Vegas, the deep state actions that are there, things that just don't add up or make sense. And then all the other the Puerto Rican hurricane stuff, and people are distracted by that. But there's much more important news globally, so feel free to take us there, my man.
Yeah. Okay, we can't. We have to talk about North Korea, and not because of anything Trump said about, the calm before the storm.
Sure.
I'm not going to pay any attention to that kind of rhetoric. What is interesting is there's been a lot of idea that, tomorrow, which is North Korea celebrates this Party Foundation Day, and it's the 72nd anniversary of the founding of its ruling Workers' Party of Korea. So
Yeah.
there was this idea that they may launch a missile around that date or on that date. Now, obviously, Seoul and Washington have reportedly enhanced surveillance operations. The interesting part is they both come out and said, we've not actually noticed North Korea preparing for nuclear or missile tests. So unless they pull something off at very short notice, it seems unlikely that that is going to happen tomorrow. I mean, that's the first thing. And there's been a lot of talk where, something major is going to happen. North Korea is going to launch a missile and it's going to hit the west coast of the US, etc. This is simply not going to happen. And then there's the idea that, that the US can launch this preemptive attack on North Korea. And in some way, the Chinese and the Russians are going to go, yeah, that's fine, just carry on doing. Well, absolute nonsense. That is not the case. I mean, the Chinese are not going to cooperate with the US on anything. And the thing that sort of bears this out in totality is the fact that the Chinese signed up to these UN sanctions against North Korea. And what do we find? Just only in the last week, 4 North Korean vessels have called in at Chinese bulk ports, despite the UN embargoes against North Korea's metals and minerals. And this comes about 30 days after China, notionally in inverted commas, implemented this UN resolution 2371. So basically, the Chinese turn around to the US and sticking 2 fingers up on them and saying, do you know what? We'll sign these resolutions. We're not going to pay any attention to them. We'll just carry on doing what we're going to do with with North Korea. And what are you going to do about it? Are you going to put sanctions on her? Because if you do, we're going to hit you back asymmetrically, which we have, of course, they have the ultimate economic sanction against the US in terms of the dollar. So the idea that China's doing that on the one side and is going to cooperate with the US on the other, in terms of launching an attack on North Korea, is simply not the case. And we have to come back to the point that China is being very explicit. They said to Pyongyang, if you launch an attack on the US or Japan or whoever or South Korea, you're on your own. You'll get what's coming to you. However, if the US launches a preemptive strike on North Korea, we're going to respond. And that basically means that they're going to respond in terms of attacking the US. And we've heard before, and I've said this several times, they've warned the US that if they attack them, the first thing they'll do is sink their entire fleet in the South China Sea, etc. And that's not a threat, that's a promise.
Yeah.
So the idea that somehow the Chinese are going to cooperate is not the case. And then, of course, we hear all the rhetoric that the US is going to start launching an attack, and maybe the calm before the storm is they're going to launch an attack against North Korea. And now we hear the US State Department's put a plan together to de-escalate the conflict between Washington and Pyongyang. Now, part of their strategy is freezing North Korean nuclear missile tests for a couple of months, and in return, the US will begin a direct dialogue with Pyongyang. Now, this is a Tillerson plan, obviously. So the fact is that doesn't stack up with this idea that the US is going to suddenly launch preemptive strike against Pyongyang. And now, obviously, the issue is that the problem we have currently is that Trump and Tillerson, to say they're not getting on is an understatement. I mean, for Tillerson not to deny the fact he called Trump a moron, I think is pretty damning. Mm-hmm. So the key point here is there a unified position within the US leadership? Because Trump doesn't seem to agree with this. And therefore, from Pyongyang's position, they're going to say, well, is this proposal worth anything? Yeah, we respect Tillerson's viewpoint, and maybe it's a basis to start negotiation and have a discussion. But the problem at the moment is, from Pyongyang's point of view, they want to hold these discussions at the level of military and security services, because they don't actually believe that Tillerson has much influence over Trump, which he, arguably may be the case, but then equally, even the US military personnel who are in what you might term Trump's inner circle are actually saying we don't want to go to war with North Korea. So there may be some leverage in fact that Trump's put back in the box and told to keep quiet about North Korea, even though periodically he kind of spits the dummy and then starts mouthing off on Twitter about what he thinks is going to happen. Now, the thing is, if there is this potential for US North Korean talk, unsurprisingly, who's it going to be going through? The Russians are going to be involved. I think Pyongyang actually said, if we're going to have these talks, we want to do it in Moscow on neutral territory. And I think that's probably very reasonable. Whether that will irk Trump or not particularly Trump, but the US administration's an entirely different matter. So in a sense, that's where we are in terms of North Korea. So all this high octane rhetoric that war's imminent is not a reality. It doesn't mean that position can't change, and it's very possible that it could do. I mean, as I said back in kind of April time, if you're talking about high octane and the likelihood of war, it was hugely likely back then when no one was talking about it. And the other reality is, if people really genuinely think something's going to happen on a certain date, it's not going to happen. Because what's the one thing the US military is not going to do? They're not going to telegraph and tell Pyongyang, oh, by the way, we might strike you in this period of time. They're not going to forewarn them. If they're going to do it, they'll just do it.
Unless, of course, it's the Barack Obama administration, then then they do that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just absolutely farcical. So in that sense, I think we have to take stock of what's going on. I mean, the picture can change, but currently, no, there's no evidence that the US is going to launch any preemptive strike. There's no evidence North Korea will launch a missile in the next few days. It doesn't mean they might not launch one next week. Are they going to actually strike a target? It's incredulous to imagine they would do so, because they know what the consequences are. They're on their own. And the US can do what the hell they like, and the Chinese will step back and say, well, we warned you, you're going to have to take the consequences. Now, it doesn't mean that they're going to allow regime change. And then there's talk of they're going to have regime change in North Korea. Well, that's been attempts by being ongoing for the last couple of years to do that with the North Korean administration or regime, and they've failed. They haven't been able to do it. So do they really think if they launch a preemptive strike on North Korea, the North Korean people are not going to desert their leader, no matter how insane we feel he is or isn't? That's going to just galvanize them around him. So that's not a reality either. So we have to just bear in mind as well that China will carry on trading with them and break every UN resolution. And then they'll turn around and say, if the Americans get in a strop about it, and say, well, we don't care. What are you going to do about it? And what can the US do about it, apart from seriously impose sanctions on China? I mean, do they think the Chinese will stand there and tolerate that? Of course they're not. So what North Korea is all about, from the Chinese perspective, is they've set a trap for the US. Now, is the US stupid enough to fall into it? Well, hopefully not. But if they do, there's only one nation that's going to come out worse off than anybody, never mind what happens to North Korea, South Korea, or anything else, and that's the US. And that's what China's precisely done. They've set them a trap. And they've said, okay, if you want to jump into it, we'll give you a spade and you can dig the hole as deep as you like. That's your choice. But hopefully common sense will prevail and the US will walk away and not get involved in those kind of actions in North Korea.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think a lot of people who are holding their breath, waiting for, oh my God, is it going to be some sort of war? Just needs to understand, the real situation of that entire theater of operations over there. War is not. It's not even an option. It's not even feasible. It's not even based on reality. It's not even winnable. So there's not going to be no war. What is happening and what will continue to happen is the constant erosion of U.S. hegemony. Is the constant belittling of U.S. rhetoric, and the U.S. will fade into the background, so to speak, on the world stage, Paul.
Well, yeah, and they have. The sad part is they don't have any need to, but because of the belligerent stance amongst a small minority of people who are certainly pushing the Trump administration in ways that is completely detrimental to the US on the international stage, but also ultimately domestically. And there's no doubt about it. And he still refuses to wake up to the reality of what's going on. And in essence is just becoming is become the bidding war for other parties who want to stoke tensions in that region. Same with Iran. I mean, is he going to seriously suggest reneging on the Iran nuclear deal? Well, there's major problems with that. Firstly, North Korea is going to turn around and say, do you know what? The US once again reneges on a deal. Why would we ever trust them? And bearing in mind, they trusted the US twice before on deals, and the US reneged on them before the ink was dry. And that's why North Korea doesn't trust the US. That doesn't in any way detract from the insanity of North Korea and what goes on there. But they're not. The US never helps themselves. This is a major, major problem. And in terms of Iran, what's the alternative? They walk away from it. Do they think the rest of the world's just going to do likewise? No. So in the process, all they're going to do is alienate and isolate themselves further in the process, because Europe's not going to turn their back on Iran. The US military have said that Iran's fully compliant with the nuclear treaty. China does, Russia does. The only nations on the planet who say to the contrary seem to be the US and Israel. No, everyone else is perfectly fine. They're not, and even then, the US rhetoric is, well, they're not compliant in the spirit of this treaty. Whatever, no one knows what that actually means. I don't even think the US knows what it means. But it's just a lame excuse to suggest they can walk away from it. But the days have gone where the US would have walked away from it, and the rest of the world would have moved away in agreement. They're just not going to do it because. And of course, we have to then move on to Saudi. And whilst I don't want to go into the masses of detail, because I did it with the podcast and put all the detail as to what happened, but there are certain things that have subsequently been said that I think are worthy of comment. Apart from the fact, 3 years ago I said the key swing nations in the world will rotate to the east. They'll rotate to Russia and China and Saudi was one of them. And people said that will never happen. And this is insane. You're talking nonsense. Well, here we are in 2017. We finally got to the point where that Saudi-Russian meeting in Moscow was historic for many reasons, and not least, who was bowing to who in the Kremlin?
Yeah.
King Salman was bowing to Putin. Now, when we see the US leaders go, they're not so much bowing; they're almost bent in half, standing before him. So that speaks huge volumes for the respect that Russia and Putin has on a world stage. Now, I'm not suggesting anybody should bow to anyone, but the fact they did is hugely symbolic. And what's some interesting points that come out of it? Well, the Saudi foreign minister has immediately said, look, it's possible to reach an agreement amongst all the members of the international community to lift sanctions against Russia. Saudi knows it's ridiculous, it's pointless, and they believe it's quite likely it will happen soon. Now, that could be interesting with respect to the US's point of view on it. However, what is also interesting is that Saudi said, look, just because we want to develop strong relations with Russia doesn't mean it violates the relationship we have with the US. The US wants to walk away from it. That's their problem. But, us developing the relations we are with Russia is not violating anything. As far as we're concerned, these sanctions don't apply to us. We're not interested in them. And we want to cooperate with nations such as Russia. Well, we know why they want to cooperate with Russia and China, hence why part of the whole Petro-Yuan gold complex and contracts. That is one of the fundamental reasons, but also because Saudi realizes the US on the world stage is dying a death. The dollar's dying in it. And people may say, well, it's just a marriage of convenience. Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But the fact is, the Saudi ministers also said, strong relations with Russia is going to really help solve the problems in the Middle East. Well, yes, they are, and it's proved because the Middle East was in disarray, and in the last 2 years, in this fundamental mind shift and change in terms of not just the war in Syria, but also with the relations that Russia has with all these nations. And even though these nations disagree with each other, they know that they're all that they're respectively trading. Like the Qataris are working with the Russians, and we've got the Saudis doing the same thing, even though the whole Saudi-Qatar debacle rolls on, although obviously it's not really achieved the aims that Saudi expected to. And there's no doubt Saudi were put up to doing this. And they've realised they were just another patsy in terms of US foreign policy to destabilise the region, and it's failed.
Sure.
So in that sense, that's one interesting dynamic. Now, what happens? We immediately see the fact that there's all these huge statements coming out of intent between the two nations. And what do we find? Almost immediately, security forces fall an attack near the King's Palace, saying that this assailant and guards were killed in the incident. We then hear the US Embassy in Saudi saying to the US citizens, you must exercise caution in the area around this palace. Then we find out that back in August, the Saudi Crown Prince, who's now obviously Mohammed bin Salman, there was an assassination attempt at one of the royal family palaces. Now, these are all connected. There's no doubt if the Saudis had walked out of Moscow with no agreements, there wouldn't have been any attack on the King's Palace.
Right.
That is an absolute certainty. So there's no coincidence this has happened. And you have the assassination attempt on Mohammed bin Salman is precisely because he's very much more pro-Russia, pro-China, and he's not what the US wants to see in taking over as the king. So there's immediately an interesting development. Then we also see there's been a lot of criticism levied at Saudi for their role in Daesh, etc. Now, what do we find within the same period of time? Saudi security forces have dismantled a terror cell linked to Daesh inside Saudi Arabia. They've broken the whole operation, killed a number of the operatives, detained a number of other people, and seized all these weapons and explosive substances. Now, is that a big coincidence? No, it's not. There's a mind shift and a change in terms of Saudi policy. But perhaps one of the most damning statements that came out, even though it's laced with total hypocrisy, was when the foreign minister said, and I say this because people will laugh when I say it, but he said that Russia and Saudi do not interfere in the domestic issues of other nations, saying that both countries reject the idea of imposing alien principles onto other societies. Well, we know from a Saudi perspective that's ridiculous because they've spent, tens of millions spreading Wahhabi ideology throughout the world. However, why did he say it? Because the intent of the statement is far more important than the merits of the reality of it. In essence, it's a clear reference to the US, which we know for decades has had this foreign policy designed to put in US or cabal-friendly regimes throughout the world, modelled on a cabal style of governance. I mean, that stands to reason. And while Saudis tended to support these efforts, this statement effectively criticising the US model of foreign policy, made whilst in Russia, is a clear signal that Saudi wants to distance itself from what they now perceive to be the utterly failed US geopolitical strategy in the Middle East and far beyond. That's why he said it. I mean, ignore the hypocrisy angle. And of course, the future depends very much on, do Saudi actually clean their own act up in the process? It's all well and good to criticize other nations, but we'll see what actually happens in that regard. But the fact the foreign ministry made the statement is hugely damning in terms of US-Saudi relations, and a clear indication that the rotation from the west to the east, and Saudi being the key nation to rotate in the Middle East, is now completely and utterly without question. And yes, it's taken a long time to come about, but as I've always said, there are no timescales on anything. These are all event-driven scenarios, but this is a major, major event that's come about. And there's a whole bunch of other details which we won't go into because we could spend the whole hour just talking about that. But the reality is that's a seismic shift in Middle Eastern politics, and it's further indication of the nation who is ultimately getting more and more isolated is Israel. Because we know that Russia has Israel on a leash. They've always relied, the idea that Saudi and Israel weren't allies through everything is of course nonsense, because they absolutely were. But Saudi's repositioning itself. It's no longer going to take the US kind of line of course of action for the Middle East. Therefore, that puts Israel in an even deeper quandary, because really, to all intents and purposes, how much support is the US really providing Israel now? I mean, apart from the whole Iranian angle, which is still, rumbling on, as we said earlier on, they largely have very little support. And this also, of course, makes it very dangerous and very risky as to how Israel's likely to react. However, I don't think for 1 minute they're going to start a war. They're not going to start trying to throw the weight around and launch an attack on Hezbollah or anything like that, because the Russians have warned them. Rather like the US were warned about North Korea, the Russians have warned the Israelis, which is why they stopped launching missions into Syria. And they actually started launching missiles from the Lebanese territory, because the Russians had warned them, if you enter Saudi airspace, we'll shoot you down. They didn't actually say to them, if you enter Lebanese airspace, we'll shoot you down, because they have no authority or jurisdiction to do it. That's precisely why Saudi started launching missile attacks from Lebanese soil, because they knew what the consequences would be. So I don't think for 1 minute, however, if they were to launch a war of some description on Lebanese soil, that then the Russians wouldn't just sit back, because the Lebanese undoubtedly would say, we need your assistance to get involved in that regard. So I think that, as much as anything, is another major shift and further isolates Israel in the process. So it's not just Saudi rotating east and rotating away from the Western cabal, it's also the impact that it will have on Israel in the process.
I mean, who do we have left, Paul? We've alienated the Turks. We've alienated the Sauds. We've alienated UAE. We've alienated Egypt. Who do we have left? We just have Israel in the region, it seems like. That's about it.
Yeah, and well, unfortunately. And then, of course, it's not just who the US is alienating in terms of in the Middle East, even though it's pretty huge. But the other thing that we have to mention, which I just found absolutely staggering. We know that Russia and Saudi, and I think it's been officially, signed off today, was the S-400 purchases. Now, what is incredulous?
The Saudis, the Russians signed off on that?
Yeah, I think it's signed off today.
Interesting.
Huh. And what's amused me was the US State Department on Friday, probably panicking on the back of the Russian-Saudi visit, approved a 15 billion sale of the THAAD to Saudi. And they stated with absolute all sincerity that the deployment of the THAAD will support the long-term security of Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region in the threat of Iranian and other regional threats. I mean, and apparently Congress has 30 days to pass the legislation to block the deal, or will allow it to move forward. Now, if they've got any semblance of dignity, they will just block it, because there is no way that the Saudis are going to say, well, actually, we're purchasing the S-400, but by the way, we'll just buy the THAAD from you as well. Bearing in mind, we know how useful they are when, in terms of
Kim Jong-un is lighting them up, and THAAD does a great job in stopping those North Korean rocket launches.
Yeah, they just watch them pass over, various airspace, and they don't do anything, because they're incapable of doing anything. I mean, it's horrible to keep sort of attacking the US military in terms of their hardware, but it is, I'm sorry, the THAAD is absolutely useless. I mean, there's no other word. I mean, I wrote the article about the F-35, and really it's probably on par with the F-35, which is an absolute shambles as well. And
well, don't say that. You're going to get hate mail.
I know, but it's not. It's not. I'm not. This isn't. It's not personal to the people of the US. This is a damning indictment of the waste of taxpayers' money in developing these missile defense systems and planes. When what's the F-35? $1.5 trillion. Imagine if that had been spent productively in developing the US economy and building that could have paid a huge, significant amount of money to regenerate the US infrastructure of the country. That puts it in context. it is a very sad, damning indictment. And another thing, and I wrote a pretty large piece for in terms of the podcast. The gist of it is, and I'll just give the gist, that the US currently is in no position to fight any war with any nation.
Correct.
And that would include North Korea. They're militarily, for a whole bunch of reasons we won't go into, is extremely weak and incapable of fighting. Now, this isn't some tin pot, report that was written. This is a report that was written that provide advisory counsel to the Trump administration. This isn't just some little college student who came up with the equivalent to the weapons of mass destruction analogy. It's factual, it's correct, but it also proves the fact for all the hot air rhetoric. The US isn't in any position to start launching wars in regions of the world, particularly, for example, like North Korea or Iran or anywhere else for that matter. And that's a hugely damning indictment of and crass waste of money, crass waste of time. There's no doubt. People I feel most sorry for in all this is the US military personnel themselves. You have to utilize this equipment and are in such a substandard manner and are put into positions in the world where they probably don't want to be, but in the course of duty they have to be there. They're the people we have to ultimately feel sorry for because they're being put in intolerable positions by morons is being polite, by a US administration and people within it who don't give a damn about any American person, be it in their own nation or their fighting forces or the military personnel anywhere in the world. That's the thing that annoys me most. And I'm sorry for highlighting the example of some of the US military hardware, but it's something that the UK is not much better. The hardware is absolutely useless in the UK as well. So let's be balanced about this. But it is a very damning indictment of how military personnel in the West have to use substandard equipment and are put into environments that are highly dangerous, and it shouldn't be tolerated. And it's about time the military themselves came back and said, "Excuse me, we're not tolerating this anymore. We're not." There was a lot of vitriol when it came to what went on in Afghanistan and Iraq, and that anger has never dissipated. And I think the military needs to push back and say enough's enough. And I think in part that's why we've had the attitude towards North Korea, because people within the US military who understand the reality, people like Trump don't understand anything in terms of that side of military warfare and military conflict. That's why they're pushing back and saying we cannot simply go to war with North Korea or anyone else for that matter in the process. I think that's because there's
yeah, I agree with you, Paul. I mean, what we have here is basically just a marketing campaign. That's what the military-industrial complex is. People ask me all the time, well, why are they making crappy military equipment? Well, the objective is not to win a war. So why create effective weapon systems that guarantee victory? No, you want to create substandard weapon systems. You want troops getting killed, just enough, so you can have the constant recommitting of troops into the region. You can have constant perpetual war. And that's the ball game here. It's ridiculous. And most Americans think we have the most advanced weaponry on planet Earth. No, we don't. We seriously do not.
No, I mean another example of problems that have surfaced is the US drone program. Now, Creech Air Force Base, which is the home of US's drone program, where they remotely launch missile attacks from these Reaper and Predator drones in Yemen, Libya, Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, etc. They've detected this, they're calling it mysterious spyware, which was embedded in drone cockpits. They're obviously the control stations that pilots use to control drone. Now, apparently this virus was first detected a couple of weeks ago. Now, it's not prevented them from launching flying missions. There's been no confirmed incidents, they claim of classified information being lost or sent to an outside source. But the virus, they keep wiping it off their, computer networks, and it reappears almost immediately. And they're going, well, we think it's benign, but we just don't know. I mean, how do they actually not know that, in fact, this spyware is transmitting information that they're unaware it's been sent? Because someone's not just going to infect something with spyware embedded in these drone cockpits for no reason other than just to have some kind of sick joke that they think is quite amusing that it keeps reappearing. Undoubtedly, it's reactivating, and somebody, and I'm not saying who because I don't know, but I suspect somebody is indeed logging classified information, and all the missions that are being launched all around the world are now known by some third party, whoever that might be. And that's another damning indictment that the US drone program's been completely compromised. And almost this kind of laissez-faire attitude of, well, we don't think it's a problem, but the truth is we just don't know. But we're wiping it off our systems, and it comes back almost immediately. This is another huge problem, and it's just another damning indictment of significant failures. Because whatever we may think, and we may completely disagree with US military foreign policy, and yes, largely I would have to agree. But at the same point in time, we don't want this kind of classified information being compromised, because whose hands is it ending up in? And people will go, well, it's probably the Russians or maybe the Chinese. Maybe it is. Maybe it isn't. Maybe we don't know who it is, and it could be seriously damaging to, once again, to US military personnel in the process. So again, we have, but it's worth mentioning it because it's another significant problem that seems to just rear its head on a kind of near monthly basis, that some aspect of the US military, there's some huge problem that rears its head and we hear about. And of course, the fact we hear about it's recently happened doesn't necessarily mean that it recently happened. It could have happened months ago, years ago. We don't know. But the fact they've had to publicly acknowledge that is probably indicative that it's got to the point that you don't normally have a problem and come out straight away and say, well, we'll hold up our hands. We've got these major problems be it the drone program or anything else. That it's clearly indicative that this problem's probably been around for considerably longer than they would like to care to admit.
Remember when the Iranians hacked the American Reaper drone and flew it back to an Iranian base?
Yeah, they downed it without a single scratch on it. It terrified the Pentagon almost had an aneurysm because the Iranians were parading this, and they were looking at it going, hang on, there's not a scratch on it. And there literally wasn't a scratch. There was no damage on it. It's not like they shot it out of the sky and then just put it up for, as some kind of trophy. No, there wasn't a scratch on it. So they downed it. And it terrified the US military, the Pentagon, etc., because they realized Iran's got technology we don't know anything about, which of course they do have.
Right. Which people will easily gloss over that fact and be like, oh, they just hacked into it. No, let's unpack that a little bit. When you're talking about hacking into a drone, not only were they able to hack into the secure encrypted communication link to the drone, but they had the software to manually land that drone on an Iranian airfield with zero problems. In other words, the flight control systems integrated perfectly. The instrument panels integrated perfectly. Everything about it integrated perfectly, and they were able to land it without a hitch. That means that requires some pretty powerful software, number one, and some ingenuity, number two, and the fact that they already had the software already set up. It was already set up. It was waiting to test it out, and boom, they got it, man.
Yeah, and it's great you brought that point up, because that precisely feeds into the concerns I would have about the current US drone program being hacked by this malware, spyware, whatever you want to call it.
Right.
It's indicative of a major problem that can be coming further down the track. So yeah, it's great that you mentioned that point. Something else worth mentioning, and we talk about the US's lack of involvement in the One Belt, One Road, and you mentioned it earlier with V. I caught the sort of tail end of the morning show you did with him. But what is it? We've talked about this before. Is the CPEC? It's the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. Now, the US has got very, very bent out of shape about this. But when you actually hear the reasoning, it's absolutely staggering, because Pakistan and China have just recently dismissed a statement. This came from, I think it was Mattis, and he basically said that this One Belt, One Road initiative is a major problem in Pakistan and China because it passes through a disputed territory, which is the Kashmir region. Now, apparently he was testifying before the Senate Arms Services Committee, and he claims this is part of this disputed territory. Okay, we can argue about the whys and wherefores of that, although there is a glaring omission that he forgot in history, but we'll come to that shortly. Now, the fact is that this One Belt, One Road, as he refers to it, goes through this disputed territory. He thinks, and what he actually thinks is, it's that in some way, the One Belt, One Road is a kind of diktat. It's like a dictatorship that the Chinese are trying to impose on the rest of the world. They think that, in this globalized world that they like to refer to, which isn't globalization, it's just cabal centralization, that there's all these one belt, one roads. And they're saying, well, no one nation should put itself in a position of dictating like the Chinese are with the One Belt, One Road. And it's opposed to the one that going through China because it passes through this disputed territory. However, what Mattis and probably everyone else failed to remember is, in 1960, it goes back a fair way, there was an Indus Water Treaty. Now, the US contractors were allowed to build a dam in Kashmir. Well, they didn't have a problem then with this disputed territory. Whenever they were able to, and subsequently there are other instances where the US were able to take economic and political advantage in the Kashmir region, they didn't have a problem. Now they have a problem. And of course, what does it do? It riles the Chinese, who come back and say, this is insane comments from Mattis. They say in the One Belt, One Road initiative was backed by the UN. Okay, we can think what we like about the UN, and we all have major issues with that. But that's factually true. And the CPEC is an economic cooperation initiative. Well, yes, it is. But the fact is, it shows the level of desperation that instead of the US turning to the Pakistanis and go, well, how could we do something? Well, can we do something with you? No, what we'll do is we'll just belittle your efforts to work with the Chinese. We'll find some spurious reasons to claim it's actually a dictatorship imposed by China, and you have no right to allow this to pass through this region, disputed or otherwise. And by the way, we'll just alienate the Chinese even more, just when the whole point is that Trump's supposed to have this visit, is going to China in November. And Tillerson and numerous other people are doing everything they can to smooth that relationship and try to restore some kind of diplomacy with the Chinese, who are still furious about a whole bunch of reasons, and rightly so, in terms of the US threatening them with sanctions, and etc. And what does Mattis do? He just throws more. It's like throwing petrol on the fire. And it's just kind of insane rhetoric. And to call the One Belt, One Road a Chinese dictatorship is probably the most staggering level of hypocrisy you could ever hear, given what exactly has the US done to the Middle East, for example? And at what point has it ever been through mutual win-win situations? Never.
And
it's just ridiculous.
Right. And the funny thing is, Paul, nobody in the world believes the U.S. rhetoric saying that the One Belt, One Road is a Chinese dictatorship. Nobody in the world believes that. Only Western stooges. The U.S. only says this to keep any sort of European nations, allies, or partners from inquiring about the One Belt, One Road, because they know that if anybody would take 5 minutes to take a look at it, they'd find out rather quickly that this is the greatest thing in human history since the invention of fire, Paul.
Absolutely, and every nation who's signed up to it's going, well, it doesn't look like much of a dictatorship to me because every side's winning. Yeah, for sure, China wins on both sides of the equation, and no one's disputing that. But other nations are benefiting hugely from it. And for them, it's a welcome change from having a dictatorship, which ironically was, dictating to them in terms of foreign policy and domestic policy. And, if you don't toe the line, then there are going to be serious consequences. No one can dispute that because history proves that. And then, interestingly, I dug up a statistic to do with the US economy, which kind of I thought was highly indicative of a complete ignorance of how dependent the US is on foreign direct investment. Now, back in 2015, there was record amounts of nearly about $470 billion. And in 2016, it was about $460 billion. which is the second highest on record. So 2015, 2016, huge foreign direct investment, which the US needs. Let's not mince our words, they do need it. If you compare that to 2012 to 2014, that was double, because then they were roughly about 200 billion. Still not chicken feed, but the considerable increase in 2015, 2016. Now, what was this foreign direct investment in? In manufacturing? Well, the US needs it. It was in chemical manufacturing, and that accounted for a reasonable proportion of it. Not entirely, but largely it's across the manufacturing space. That accounts for most of those. Okay, now that shows how dependent the US is in foreign direct investment. So what does it do currently? It goes around annoying the hell out of nearly every nation on the planet.
Yep.
When it should be going around trying to be friends with every nation on the planet, saying, do you know what? We made 460 or 470 billion. Let's get it up to 550 or 700 billion or a trillion, because that's the kind of direct investment we need. And China's principally the one that's going to do that. We know that that's irrefutable. Whatever people feel about China, dislike China, it doesn't really matter. The reality is that's where the bulk of the direct investment is going to come. And this is why it's just the lack of understanding of the basic principles that the US needs to depend on this foreign direct investment. After all, it needs probably 2-3 trillion, and we've said this before, maybe even 4 trillion in terms of the infrastructure. It's only going to be foreign direct investment that's going to provide that, because no one's going to buy the US debt to that level. Those days have gone. It just simply isn't going to happen. And so the US therefore needs to attract this inward investment, and it's doing everything. And China and Pakistan's another example. What do they actually think? Do they really think China and Pakistan are going to say, well, actually, we'll just turn a blind eye to these comments? And by the way, well, maybe less Pakistan, no disrespect to them, but they don't have the economic strength China does. But still, don't turn your back on allies. Pakistan has been an ally. Whatever we may think about Pakistan is irrelevant. And the US is doing everything it can to turn its back on all these nations when it should be doing the exact opposite. And then we continue, and I'm still hearing people talking about the Russian economy, that Russia's economically extremely weak and very vulnerable. Well, here's an interesting statistic. The Russian deficit for their federal budget in the 9 months of the first 9 months of 2017 amounted to a whopping total of 4.6 billion US dollars. I mean, it's nothing. It's 6 times lower than it was for the same period last year, which was around 27 billion. Now, compare that to the US, which in real terms is hemorrhaging 60 billion a month, around 700 billion a year. Yeah, they produce these stats to go, well, actually, it's only 44 billion, or maybe it's 42. And then you actually factor in the reality, and it's around 60 billion. Now, that's not an indication of every aspect of an economy. But put it this way, if the US were only running a trade deficit, or a budget deficit, of 4.6 billion, you'd be going, well, that's not too bad. I think we're pretty happy with that. And that's the big glowing difference between, or the stark difference between the Russian economy and the US economy. The Russian economy has gone through hell for a number of years, and actually dug its way out of it with a central bank that isn't controlled by the Rothschild. I keep hearing people telling me all these central banks are controlled by the Rothschild. The Russian central bank is not controlled by the Rothschild. Neither is the Chinese. And because the Russian central bank has done what a central bank should do, and given solid, sound advice, and dragged the Russian economy off its knees to being relatively stable now, and with the prospect of growing and having some. I think the last figures came out; they had 3% GDP growth. Now we hear the US has 2%, or it's not. It's just an illusion. Their economy has been in recession for nigh on a decade.
Yeah.
Whatever anyone says. I mean, if you want, just go to John Williams on Shadow Stats. I mean, the guy there is a genius at what he does, and he does things far better than I could ever do. And the stats prove this to be true. I mean, it's just, he proves all the economic reality is nothing like the illusion we're presented. So
Right.
therefore, it's another example of, and why has the Russian economy actually got stronger? The irony is because the US imposed sanctions on them, and the Russians turned around and went, okay, well, what are we going to do about this? Oh, I know. First of all, we'll just find diverse economies to trade with. Who can trade with? We'll find innovative ways to trade with nations and not fall foul of sanctions. And we'll have import substitution, and we'll strengthen our own internal economy. What have we seen recently? Record production of wheat. Every year, Russian wheat production goes up and up and up and up because they're getting more and more innovative and they're developing economic and in this case, agricultural production technique that are benefiting their economy. So in a way, the Russians don't care about sanctions. They're very happy in a way that the US did what they did because it actually has helped them. And in the process, all it's done is damage relations, particularly with Europe, in terms of the US and why. I mean, and a very small point to do with Germany. I mean, we talked about Germany rotating away from the US. Well, the German Defense Ministry is looking for a replacement for these obsolete, they're called G36 assault rifles that the German military use. Now, the German government is going to grant the bid to a domestic gun maker, and they're going to exclude US companies from the bidding. They've actually said this. Now, you may say, well, it's not a huge contract. Yeah, it's $300 billion. Sorry, million dollars. It's not, it's relative, you might say it's chicken feed. It's the principle that Germany says, we're going to give the bid to a domestic gun maker and we're going to exclude the US. This is a damning indictment all the time of what's happening to larger or lesser degrees where nations are turning around and going, we're just not tolerating this anymore because you know what? Your sanctions have wrecked our economies. And in the meantime, you still carry on trading with whoever you want, however you want. You impose them on us, but then you go and trade with Russia when it suits you because it's economically beneficial to you. But you expect us to have to suck it and get hammered economically. And every European nation has been deeply damaged by this. Russia haven't. And Russia says, well, do you know what? We just like to trade with you, but you're the ones who are going to have to stop these sanctions because we're not going to just unilaterally stop them. You're the one. I mean, it sounds maybe a bit childish, but it isn't. The reality is they just said, we've had enough. We're not going to put up with this anymore. So the choice is down to you. Do you want to remove the sanctions or don't you? And it's coming to the point where nations, and at some point, in the big event-driven scenario, nations will have to turn around to the US and go, we're not having these sanctions anymore. You can carry on sanctioning them if you like. But what are you going to do? Sanction the entire world? It's just not going to work. And these small little instances of barring US companies from bidding for assault rifles is indicative of just how fed up nations are.
Yep. Exactly correct, man. And you know what's going to happen is the nations are going to. I mean, look at the recent deal that we tried to do with LNG in Europe. We've purposely sabotaged the Russian supply of LNG into the European continent, and the offer that we're giving the Europeans was, "Hey, don't worry about the Russian gas. Here, buy ours." And the Europeans are like, "But yours is 50% more expensive." And nowhere near as reliable. That's okay. We're pals. We're buddies. We're good friends. Go ahead and buy it. This is insane.
I know it's just staggering, and you know it's just like, and Cuba's a great example where there was this whole mysterious thing with the U.S. embassy and all these people becoming ill, and I don't believe for one minute it had anything to do with Cuba, and yet there was then this spat, and Cuban diplomats are being expelled, and then what do you find? Russian oil giant Rosneft is going to develop cooperation with Cuba on the expansion of oil supplies, production, and upgrade of their refinery. And this is exactly what happens. The US upsets nations, and the Russians go, well, do you know what? We've got great, strong relations. And Cuba goes, well, fine. Well, we can sign deals. You can help us expand on the volume of supplies, joint production project. You can put investment into our oil refinery and help to grow our economy, which the Cuban economy is extremely weak. We know that. And this is what happens. And you'd think after it happened once, twice, three times, but when it happens 10, 20, 30 times, at what point is someone in the US administration turning around going, do you know what? When are we going to change our insane foreign policy? Because we're the ones who are losing. They could have restored relations with Cuba. They could have pushed the Russians and the Chinese out of Cuba. And if they played ball, the Cubans probably would have said, you know what? We'll work with you. Okay, we're going to have to rebuild the trust. And there isn't a great deal of trust between the Cubans and the US on both sides for very, very different reasons. But in the process, all they're doing is pushing them into the arms of the Russians and the Chinese. And what is Russia doing in the process? They're dumping dollars and they're buying a share in assets. So they're really becoming like a microcosm of what China's doing. This is what Russia's doing all around the world. They're now investing in projects and they're dumping dollars and buying assets because they know full well what's coming down the track. And yet China does it, Russia does it, and the US, the UK, and they're just as guilty. They don't see what's coming. It's like, no, China's this very weak nation. They just have to do as they're told. That they're not economically in any position. Great example is the whole kind of Saudi, the whole petro-yuan gold deal.
Yeah.
Now, all we keep hearing is, well, China couldn't possibly do this because they don't have enough gold. Well, first off, China has around 40,000 tons of gold. Russia has even more gold than China, significantly more gold than China. But here's the other point. China doesn't have to sell an ounce of its own gold to back the trades with gold. What do they think the Shanghai Cooperation Organization? No, sorry, the Shanghai Gold Exchange is. That's what they will utilize. They don't have to sell any of their gold in the process.
Right.
I mean, and it's the fact that people just won't accept. I mean, people just think, no, China and Russia don't have that volume of gold. We know about it. Well, why would they even bother telling? Why are they going to telegraph their plans? I mean, it's rather like the Russian military. They spent years hiding what they were really spending by effectively falsifying their accounts. So the US went, well, Russia's spending nothing on military technology, so we won't bother either. And meanwhile, Russia was doing precisely the opposite. So why do we have to have this idea that we don't trust the Russians on anything? They lie to us about everything. They're meddling in every Western nation on the planet. They're trying to overthrow leaders. But by the way, they always tell us the truth about their gold holdings. You can't accuse them of being dishonest about everything, but completely straight and honest about their gold holdings.
Well, we know that, Mnuchin went into Fort Knox, Paul, and saw the pickle barrel that had a few coins of gold in there. And then he came out and said, don't worry, American public, the gold is safe.
Well, the fact is, when was it last audited?
No one knows.
I mean,
it never was audited.
It's rather like the Federal Reserve's never been audited in 100 years.
No, the Fed, the Fort Knox, IRS, none of these guys are audited. God forbid. That's why they hate the blockchain. Oh no, we don't want the blockchain. No, don't want that. Oh man.
No, but apparently the IMF does. The IMF's going to bring out the SDR, and it's probably going to put it on blockchain, and it's going to be maybe it's gold backed. Yeah, apparently.
Well, they're doing that because the Chinese are telling them to do it, because that's who's calling the shots at the IMF right now is China. And it's only a matter of time before the IMF becomes part of the AIBB. I mean the AIIB.
Well, the thing is the SDR is never going to see the light of day for one simple reason.
Exactly.
It's a basket of basket case currencies. You can't have. Well, actually, the US dollar is going to die, but by the way, it's going to be part of the SDR. All these, fiat currencies, the yen. These currencies will eventually be gold backed themselves or asset backed in some way, and the SDR is not going to be part of anything. China didn't join the SDR because it thought it had a future. China was just using it as a smokescreen. To lull the West into believing they took it seriously. They don't take it seriously, and they're not interested in the SDR. None. Because they don't. Why do they need to be interested? They don't care what the IMF does. The IMF has become an irrelevance, I mean, and has no, I mean, it has no bearing on the world anymore, as you've rightly pointed out. Who's the one thing that props up the IMF and
It's China.
prevented it imploding was China. Yeah,
2 years in a row.
exactly. And China's not doing it because it wants to keep the IMF going. The Chinese don't have any interest. Chinese don't care about the IMF or any of the Western financial institutions, because if they did, they wouldn't bother of creating the AIIB, etc., and all these other vehicles and the New Development Bank and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, etc., etc., if they actually genuinely took it seriously. They don't take it seriously. Yeah, the interesting thing is the cabal thinks this is what's going to happen. But this is the idea that the Chinese are in the back pockets of the cabal, and then we have it's just, everything's going to rotate from west to east and nothing's going to change. In reality, the cabal will still be in control. That is never going to happen. And if anyone knows their history, and I know we labour this point, but it's worth mentioning it. Know your history. Just look at what the Opium Wars did. Do you really think the Chinese have forgiven the West for that? Do you think the Russians have forgiven the West for overthrowing the Tsars and imposing? Yes, they imposed communism on the Russian people. It was a Western cabal exercise. It was their ism, not some socialist ideology that came out the East. No, it was the cabal who imposed communism. Why? Because they wanted to destroy the Tsars. Why? Because the Tsars had more wealth and power than the Rothschilds and the Federal Reserve, etc. at that point in time. That's why they got rid of them. And that was one of the fundamental reasons for World War One. People go, well, what the hell was the point of World War One? It never achieved anything. And it didn't. No, but that was the primary objective. Right. Was to create the Russian Revolution, overthrow the Tsars, destabilize Russia, impose communism, and then have it as a kind of bogeyman for the next, however long they managed to stretch it out for, which actually turned out to be 74 years. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the whole system collapsed, and it was the end of communism, and Russia is not a communist nation now, even though people like to believe it is. And that's the kind of reality. These nations are never going to kowtow to the very people who destroyed their nation, who imposed incredible suffering on the Russian people.
Right.
For decades. Does anyone really think Stalin was another cabal stooge?
Yeah, he wasn't even Russian.
In Russia. Yeah, and look at what he did to the Russian people.
Right, and none of these guys who were in charge in Russia from the onset of communism were Russian.
No, they're all just Western-backed stooges put in.
Correct.
And it took really until Putin. People will talk about Yeltsin and Gorbachev, but it was really Putin who said, right, enough's enough. I'm going to kick the Western cabal interest out of Russia and restore the Russian nation to what it is. And it's taken a long time, but they've grimly stuck to their task, and now they're reaping the benefit. And ultimately, it's the same with China. Yeah, there was huge infiltration in China. They've removed that infiltration. And it's still, there's no doubt there's still problems there. But really, the Western cabal has no influence on Chinese or Russian policy.
Yeah.
Because if they did, they wouldn't be doing everything to try and oppose them. And this comes back to the point, is we still get this idea, people go, Trump's just a cabal stooge. Well, if he is, why have they spent nearly the whole time he's been in office trying to remove him? And they're still trying to remove him. What would be the point? Or is it some gigantic 4 or 5D chess move that
it's a 5D chess move, Paul. It's a 5D chess move, and you and I can't figure that out. That's what it is.
Yeah. I mean, it just simply is not the case. I mean, Trump has screwed up very badly, and he's not done what he's supposed to do. But it doesn't make him a cabal stooge. Far from it. That is not what he is. He's just incredibly badly advised, and he's listening to people. And you know what? The one thing that
history to the smartest man in Washington D.C. today, and that is the one and only Jared of Arabia.
Exactly, and history will prove. They always say don't work with your relations. Well, in the case of, in terms of government, in terms of being in government, or the president of the US, never work with family members in your administration, because it is an absolute disaster. And that will be the most damning indictment of anything to do with the Trump administration, is that He had Kushner, who he listens to his every word, and Kushner's given him the worst possible advice. Now he may be doing it.
I think you're wrong, Paul. I think Kushner. When you look at his track record, let's look at his track record real quick. He bought a newspaper company right before print publishing was collapsing. He bought a skyscraper at the height of right before the housing market collapsed. He bought a skyscraper. These are brilliant moves. He backed the wrong candidate in Alabama, told Trump to go support him, and that blew up in his face. Kushner is I mean, look at this. And he went to Saudi Arabia. He's hammering out the Middle Eastern peace deal. He's now in charge of the African policy. It's amazing. History's going to prove that Jared Kushner was the greatest statesman that the world has ever seen. Oh, man.
And I think your statement will go down in history as the most ironic statement ever made.
Exactly correct.
I mean, but that is the big problem. That is Trump's biggest problem. Is Kushner. I mean, it's undoubtedly now we can argue about what's Kushner's motivation. It doesn't really matter, and I really don't care one way or the other. Whatever his reasoning is, the advice he is giving Trump is hugely detrimental to Trump, to the administration, to the U.S. people, to U.S. foreign policy and U.S. domestic policy, because the point now is, and we've just proved that with just foreign direct investment as one example, the U.S. whatever it does on the world stage is going to seriously impact it domestically in terms of its economy. You can't have this. I mean, Trump might want to think he can, run roughshod and put tariffs on everyone and bring all the business home. What he fails to answer the question is, okay, Donald, where's the trillions of dollars you're going to need to rebuild the US economy? And no, you can't just print all these dollars out of thin air, as people suggest, and just reinvigorate the US economy, because therefore, Weimar Republic is going to happen. The US is in no position. That's why, for all the rhetoric, there is no indication of the US having any new infrastructure projects coming on board to regenerate and reinvigorate the US economy, because they simply don't have the money to do it.
And to date, there's not a single new factory being built here anywhere. To date.
No, not unless it's the Chinese.
Shovel. Yeah.
I mean, the Chinese are very good at taking US ailing manufacturing businesses, turning it around and doubling the amount of employees. And ironically, the people who work there are very happy because they get treated very well.
Yep.
Even though people think that, if you work for a Chinese company, you're going to have to work 90 hours a week and on slave labor wages. No, that isn't what happens. That is not what the Chinese do. And if people think that, well, we come back to our wonderful statistic that says the Chinese took 600 to 700 million people out of poverty into middle class.
Yep.
That isn't all like a country. Yeah, it does have problems. It still has economic problems, and there are people working in intolerable conditions. I don't dispute that, but 700 million people in middle class earning decent living and having a decent quality of life. There is not one Western nation that has achieved anywhere near that. In fact, it's the reverse. In the last 20 years, or particularly the last 10 years, the standard of living for people who we might term middle class is deteriorating rapidly. And they're becoming more and more dependent on debt and more leveraged. And of course, history always proves they're the ones who get killed when you have an economic crisis. It's happened for the last 200 years and nothing's going to change. The people who have nothing will never lose anything. The people who have everything, well, actually, they're going to lose everything, but that's the first time in history. But the people in the middle class bracket are the ones who will lose the most. They will the ones who will get killed because they're the most leveraged, and they were the most leveraged because they were enticed to buy cheap credit.
Yeah, you know why? Because they're playing by the rules, Paul. They're playing by the rules.
Indeed.
That's exactly what happens. Meanwhile, they get, they get hustled by the wealthy on top and hustled by the poor on the bottom. The middle class
they're the ones who are going to get really hurt badly, and that's across the world, across the Western world particularly, but not exclusively. And that is an inevitability. And this is why the fact is that, you know, the idea that the US and the Western world is going to go into another recession. They've never come out of a recession.
They never
That's
did.
that's the reality. All the economic statistics I could produce thousands of graphics that I've kept over the years, which I'm not going to do because it would bore people senseless. But it proves the US has never been out of recession, and neither is the UK, and neither is the large part of Europe.
We
It's
never
just
came out of
simply,
the tech bubble crash in early 2000, man. We never came out of that. All they did is
well,
inflate
no,
another bubble with all the systemic problems still there until the bigger bubble, which they blew, which is this quote unquote real estate bubble, which was actually more than just real estate. When that imploded, that was it. That was the trigger. Now we see all the there's no more bubbles left to inflate, Paul.
well, here you go. You know, you make a great point. There's something in terms of US non-financial corporate debt as a percentage of GDP. Now, you mentioned the dot-com bubble. It was around 45% of GDP at that time. And then we had the housing bubble in 2008, 9, again, about 45%. And then it crashed. Now, what have we had since that kind of the non-financial corporate debt since 2010 is risen to, oh, guess what? We're currently at just over 45% now. And we've gone from having a dot-com bubble to a housing bubble to everything's a bubble. I mean, there's nothing anymore that isn't a bubble. It's like every other bubble to the power of infinity.
Yep.
But don't worry, it's not a problem. You know, we're not in a recession. We don't have any financial problem.
And the unemployment
reality
rate
is,
low.
yeah, I mean, well, yeah, it staggers me that, you know, there's 100 million economically inactive people nearly in the US, but unemployment's 4.4%.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I mean, just the simple maths fails, and you know, it's not. This is not just indicative. It's the same in the UK. Unemployment's completely rigged, the figures. They fudge it to take people off the unemployment register. I mean, they have a situation in the UK where they make people who are on benefits go out and have to work for their benefits, and they make them work like 40-hour weeks to get £60 a week.
Oh my God.
And you know, if they refuse to do it, they take their benefits off them. What they call sanction them, take their benefits off them and refuse to give them their money. They don't actually try to get them a real job and say to the people who are running these rackets, by the way, actually, you know, you should be employing this person on at least minimum wage, and then get these people back into work. And even minimum wages is dubious in terms of people being able to afford to live.
Yeah,
although
so
you can get
they get £60 a week, which is about $115 a week for working 40 hours.
or 70, maybe 100, depends. Yeah, exactly. And they force them; they have to go out, and they're not doing productive jobs that, you know, will give them skills and enhance their capability to get back into the workforce. No, they'll just give them just jobs. It's just for the sake of it. And the question is, how much is the government paying these people to take these people on, instead of these people being made to pay people a fair wage and getting them back into work and actually giving people a career and some future prospect? And it's the same in the UK as the US. We have this situation where it's minimum wage jobs, not full-time jobs, not, you know, 35 hours a week, full-time, 40 hours, whatever. It's like 10, 20 hours. And people are having to work 2, 3 jobs. And you might get a couple who have to work 5, 6 jobs to earn and just to scrape an absolutely meager living. So let's not mince our words. The UK is horrendous as well. It's not just the US, the UK, and it is other European nations in the process. But the policy in the UK in terms of people being unemployed is farcical. And then, do you know what they do? Those people that they force to do this to earn their benefits, they take them off the unemployment register and say, well, actually, they're not unemployed anymore.
I love it. Only the criminally insane bureaucratic mind could come up with something like that, Paul. It's disgusting. This is why you never let government get too big for its britches. This is the kind of shenanigans that happens. It's unbelievable.
Well, it's just indicative of the fact of a society that is in total collapse.
Yeah.
It's economically in collapse. It's politically in collapse. It's socially in collapse. And more importantly, from the people's perspective, it's a government that's morally totally bankrupt. I mean, there is no other word to describe this. And that's what we've come to. And that is all to prop up the illusion that economies are strong. And the idea that economies just fall off a cliff edge is nonsense. I mean, people tried to be duped into believing that was the case in 2008 when we had the financial crisis. 2001 we had the whole dot-com bubble and it all blew up, and not really a financial crisis. The difference is they've engineered every boom and bust.
Yep.
The difference is we didn't have we kind of had a boom, but the bust was not an engineered crisis. The crisis in 2008 was something completely out of their hands, and they've spent the last 8-9 years trying to bail out water on a weekly basis and find every way to convince everybody that the economy is strong. But that was the big difference. We had a major financial crisis that they didn't engineer, even though people like to think they did, and if they do, and it's all part of a grand scheme to collapse the world economy. Well, they'd done it in 2008, so why have they spent the last 10 years trying to create the illusion it isn't? And in the process, strengthen the Chinese and the Russians, strengthen the growth of the One Belt, One Road, and in the process, have the whole world rotate against them to the point that they're weak and on the verge of collapse. There is no logic to the belief that they were behind that crisis for that very, very simple reason.
Unreal. Paul, we're at the end of the broadcast, man. Why don't you give out your shout outs and how people can follow you and contact you? Man, we're like 25 minutes over. I mean, time flies when you're having fun here, Paul.
We do. We could go on. Tell you, I could go on for weeks. So
same here. I can sit here.
One day we should just start and then see. We'll give up when we fall asleep.
That's it.
But yeah, website.
We should do a 24-hour London, Paul, and V broadcast, man. 24 hours straight.
That would be fun. That'd be a lot of fun. Make it like coast to coast, right?
Yeah,
it will be, and then until we start sort of flagging badly, it'll all fall apart. There'll be people. I'll be drifting in and out of consciousness, going, "Oh, sorry, what was that?"
That's when you know it's time to call it quits, when London Paul starts snoring.
Right. Yeah. Very briefly, obviously, the SiriusReport.com, SIRIUS. We've got the Facebook group, which has suddenly exploded into life recently, which is very nice to see. We were quite surprised, but it has done. We've got obviously the Twitter page, the Sirius Report, and yeah, we have the premium content, which yes is $4.75 a month. We think it's great value, and thank you to everyone who's subscribed and all the kind comments we've had back from people. We value it very much, and we think it's great value for money. And yes, we do cover just about everything and anything, and we try to cover as much as we can. It's very difficult currently now to be kind of topical because the world's moving at such a fast pace. But yeah, it's on the premium content tab. We're actually about to introduce a new way to pay, because a lot of people don't like PayPal, I understand that, but we're going to just have a credit card payment system only that we've been developing, and that will make life a lot easier. I think people will be a lot happier with it that way. But yeah, we'd encourage you to subscribe. And thanks very much for everyone who has done, and thanks for Rogue Money, who've really helped us hugely in 2017, and we're very, very grateful, and we're always appreciative of that fact.
Hey, you're welcome, Paul. And there's going to be some great things coming also with the changes that we're doing. Everybody's going to benefit, especially our basically our friends, like the Sirius Report, who are going to do very well. Anything we can do to help you out and other content like you, because it's important. And this is why I value the Sirius Report, and I value London Paul's work. Folks, there's not a lot of people out there. I keep saying this. You can count on one hand. It's London Paul, it's myself, it's Jim, Willie, it's guys over at LaRouche Pack. That's about it. Who's doing what we do, which is on an international level. Nobody else does that. So it's important that we do everything we can to help channels, like the Sirius Report, and it's important that you guys, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, visit theseriesreport.com, get Paul's membership. All these things help out. Visit Rogue Money. All these things help out. It goes a long way. And growth is important, especially in this age of censorship that we live in. I mean, where else are you going to get this? Everybody else is trying to tell you that it's the end of the world tomorrow. Go get your beef jerky and your gun and your erectile dysfunction pills and wait out the apocalypse. That's what everybody else is telling you to do. Oh man. Anyway, Paul, thank you so much for being on, and we'll be back.
Yeah, it's a pleasure, and thank you. Yeah.
Always a pleasure. All right, CJ, take it away, buddy.